Well, guys, what an exciting day today. We have an amazing guest. But before I introduce our guest today, I want to say happy Hispanic Heritage Month. I know I'm a proud born and raised Colombian, just like my co-host Carolina Millman. And I just want to say that how proud I am of this team, about what Atlantic Bay has accomplished in the last 2 years. The amount of diversity we have now in our company, it's incredible, and we're only growing more and more and more. I had the pleasure of talking to our guest, Laura Arce. Did I say it correctly? Is it Arce?
You got it. That's perfect.
Laura Arce. Guys, let me give you an overview of Laura. Laura's current role, she's the Senior Vice President of Economic Initiative in UnidosUS. She leads the Home Ownership Means Equity Initiative, a multi-year effort aiming to increase Latino homeownership, specifically to add 4 million new Latino homeowners between 2020 and 2030. We're almost there, but we still got plenty of time. A little bit about Laura. Laura has worked in across different sectors: public, private, nonprofit. She was the senior vice president at Wells Fargo, where she handled public policy, work related to consumer banking, home lending, and community reinvestment. Before that, and obviously, Laura, please correct me if I'm wrong, she held a senior policy analysis role at the Federal Housing Finance Agency.
That's right.
She also authored the certification application for the Raza Development Fund, the first community development financial institution to sponsor by a civil rights organization. I had the pleasure to talk to Laura about 3 weeks ago. We had an amazing podcast. She has amazing information to share with us. If you guys have any questions, please hold on to the end. Carolina will be asking some questions. I'll be asking some questions. But Carolina, you have anything to say before we begin?
Now, I'm very excited. I'm Carolina Muleman, Senior Loan Officer here at Atlantic Bay 2. And, just to touch on what you said, I'm super, super proud. The last 2 years have been incredible. It's been a work of love that we've put in the last 4.5 years at Atlantic Bay, and here we are. So super proud and very excited to hear from Laura. So, Laura, take it on.
Great. Well, thank you, Juan, Carolina. Thank you so much, and to Atlantic Bay team for inviting me back. I am going to share my screen, and hopefully this pops up okay. Let me know. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Great. Well, I'm really thrilled to be back with you all at Atlantic Bay. This is, I think, the third year in a row that you've invited me, so I feel really honored by that. Thank you. So let's dive in, and I'll give you kind of a little bit of a roadmap of what I would hope to cover with the time we have together. I'd like to start, even though I have been back, there might be some new folks in the audience. I'd love to share a little bit about me, and also UnidosUS, the organization where I work, and specifically our work in homeownership. And then I want to share some trends that we've been following related to Latino homeownership, and just some of the ways that we're analyzing it toward this goal that you mentioned that we have at the Home Initiative, which I'll talk more about. And because this is the third year, and I feel in many ways the folks at Atlantic Bay, better than most the work that we've been doing in recent years to advance Latino homeownership. And so I'd love to give you all some updates from when we last spoke, particularly related to the public policy space, some work that we're doing around research on the barriers and opportunities for Latino homeownership, and then also share a few updates of some of the work that we're doing out in the field with some of our community-based partners, which I think there's some really fun progress that we're seeing in local markets. So with that, I'll start talking a little bit just about me. I am a proud daughter and granddaughter of Mexican immigrants. My grandparents came to the US in the early 1950s. For the same reason that, most people, come to the US for, more opportunity and to be able to, create a better life for their children and eventually their grandchildren. my grandparents worked really hard and they did, I mean, just really amazing things in their life. But they never became homeowners. I think it was something that always felt for them a little bit out of reach. And it was really my parents who were the first in our family's generation to become homeowners. And this here is a picture of the first house that my parents purchased when they were newly married, just a few years. And this house, it's located in Oakland, California. It's in definitely not the best neighborhood in Oakland. It actually was a foreclosure and it was boarded up. Here you see some of the windows. You can see that the room down in the basement is still boarded up. And they just through sweat equity with help from my uncles and my grandfathers, they little by little fixed it up. And eventually they were able to sell this house after a few years and buy a nicer house in a better neighborhood that had better schools. It's kind of that American story. And I really credit, this first house and the trajectory that it put us on for our family with a lot of the opportunity that I and my brothers have had, especially when compared to my grandparents' generation. And if you squint and look really closely at the bottom of the steps, you will see a little girl. That's me. I'm thinking I'm
Oh,
maybe 2 or 3 years old in that picture. And
that
yes,
is
I
so
grew up in the San
cool.
Francisco Bay Area. So yes, we did own a VW Bug at that time. Um, so moving forward to what I do now, I work at UnidosUS, which is the country's largest Latino civil rights organization. We've been around since 1968, and we are a multi-issue organization. And so I have colleagues that focus on education, health, workforce, and other areas. The work I do, as you all know, is focused more on housing. The way we do our work is focused around 3 areas. It's policy and advocacy. It's community-based work. We have over 300 affiliates, which are independent, nonprofit, community-based organizations that are doing work that's aligned with our goals and mission in local communities across the country. And then we also do a lot of work around communications and just, uplifting our community, talking about how important the Latino segment is to local markets, but also to our national economy. Now, I mentioned that housing is one of our kind of core priority areas. And so this is, our mission statement around homeownership. And it's really focused around, building financial security and upward mobility. In the housing sector, as you all know, housing is a really huge space. And we have decided, many years ago that within housing, we were going to focus on homeownership, particularly around ways that we can support first-time and first-generation home buyers to be able to, kind of launch, goals in financial security in the ways that I know I saw in my family that was able to achieve. And we know that there are a lot of other Latino families out there who have similar dreams. And so that really is our focus within the housing space. So we've been working in the housing sector for multiple decades. But several years ago, we decided to really kind of zero in on this goal around homeownership and get much more specific and targeted. And so that's when we launched the Home Initiative, which stands for Home Ownership Means Equity. And that's what I came to Unidos to launch and to lead this initiative. And we have a really specific goal. Our goal is to advance Latino homeownership by adding 4 million new Latino homeowners this decade. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of how we see ourselves doing that, because we're a national intermediary. We're a civil rights organization. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have field offices in a few strategic states like California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. But I sometimes need to remind people that, we're not a mortgage lender, we're not a home builder. And so there are other levers that we pull in terms of advancing homeownership. And I know I've spoken about some of these, previously, but just to kind of share at a big picture, these are sort of our 5 strategies that we deploy to advancing Latino homeownership. The first is providing financial and technical resources to community-based organizations. There are a lot of really amazing nonprofits across the country that are either providing homebuyer education, or they're building affordable housing, or maybe they're attending zoning board meetings to be able to build more houses, from more of the public policy efforts. And so we're supporting the work that's happening in those local communities. Another is sponsoring research. We think research and data are really important to inform better public policies and market practices. And so this has been a really big effort that we've led around research in different elements around homeownership, and I'll give some examples a little bit later in the presentation. Advocacy is another big one. We're active both on federal policy in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based out of, but we also support advocacy efforts in those 4 states that I mentioned, where we have boots on the ground in California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. And, another thing we do is we convene stakeholders. We are really fortunate that we have a lot of different partners, like such as Atlantic Bay. We work with those in the industry, we work with policymakers, we work with think tanks, with local nonprofits, local government. And so often, we like to bring together different stakeholders to have conversations about, how to increase access to homeownership in our housing market. And sometimes there are federal levers, which I'll share a few examples, but sometimes it's more about looking at specific markets and are the right people kind of talking with each other to be able to kind of help consumers connect the dots, as part of their journey to becoming homeowners. And then the last lever we deploy is around strategic communications. And I think especially right now, building allies and, helping to talk about the message of homeownership. You all see the headlines like I do. There's a lot of negativity out there right now. I mean, it's certainly true that there are a lot of headwinds within our housing sector, but it really saddens me when I see articles about, that the next generation doesn't see homeownership as something that there is attainable to them. And, I just think while the pathway might be challenging or might be different than it was a generation earlier, for those who really want to become homeowners, there's still a path. And so I think communications is a really important element to our work to demystify the homeownership journey, and inspire people, whether it's by, giving a case study of someone who overcame challenges and became a homeowner, or just, building that pathway.
Laura,
Yes.
if I may,
Of course.
are there any specific regulations or reforms you believe will most effectively improve access to affordable housing for minority households?
Yeah, I think one report that we published in partnership with the Urban Institute earlier this year looked at the top 3 denial reasons for Latinos, like why they're denied for a mortgage. And you all know this better than I do, but it's it's DTI, it's credit history, it's down payment. And this report, like, not only did we identify them, but we kind of unpack like what's the reason and what are some of the recommendations we can make. And just to share one example, one thing we identified, and particularly around credit history, is the impact that positive rent reporting can have to building someone's credit. And so, we were really proud that we were able to put that on our paper, and we've spoken with some of the regulators, in DC around that. And we've seen there's been a really big increase in the adoption of that. And it's something that we definitely see it from the lens of looking at Latino home buyers and improving their credit. But honestly, it's making those changes impacts a lot of folks. It's a lot of, first-time home buyers, first-gen home buyers, not just, low and moderate income, particularly those who maybe don't have, generational wealth, and maybe their parents weren't homeowners. And so I think, the research, when you sort of really start unpacking what are the barriers, it allows you to find common sense solutions. Because I think now it seems very obvious, like, of course, looking at whether someone has paid their rent on time over many years, that seems like such an obvious, indicator whether or not someone will pay their mortgage. But not that many years ago, it wasn't part of the equation. So I think, that's an example of some of the ways that we can, improve the market.
Yep. Thank you so much, Laura.
Yeah. So these are some of the levers. Now, I mentioned our goal of 4 million new Latino homeowners by the end of the decade. And, that's a really big goal. And you all know in housing, it's never just one thing. And so we've broken it up into a few categories, kind of strategic goals. And the first is around expanding access to credit. And, the example I just shared around positive rent reporting, that's an example where, we do the research and then we do the advocacy to open up some of these barriers to really, in my mind, it's really about modernizing, underwriting and how we assess credit risk. The second goal we have is around increasing the supply of housing. And here it's really specific around what I call, entry-level homes or starter homes. So those homes that are affordable to a first-time buyer who isn't already in the market and hasn't benefited from, an increase in their equity in recent years. More modest housing that is that foot in the door into homeownership. So depending on the market, that might look different. It might be a condo, it might be a townhouse, it might just be a smaller, single family house. But that's another big area. And then the third is we also can't forget about the preservation of homeownership. And I was at the Federal Housing Finance Agency during the foreclosure crisis. And, when I think about homeownership preservation, my brain often just defaults to foreclosure prevention. But in today's market, it's much broader than that. I think especially, a lot of the trends that we're seeing around insurance costs. And, there are a lot of current homeowners who maybe could afford their mortgage historically, but because of the rise of insurance or in some cases taxes, the affordability of their housing payment is getting a little bit out of control. And so I think looking at what are the different levers that helps families not just become a homeowner, but really retain that homeownership so it could be part of their family's legacy, and being able to pass it on to future generations. So that's kind of an overview of the home initiative and the things that we're focused on and kind of the way we go about our work. So I'm going to transition to talk a little bit about some just homeownership trends. And, the first, just talking about homeownership rates. And there's kind of, a couple of things related to this data point. The first is we certainly have seen since the foreclosure crisis, well, prior to the foreclosure crisis, there had been growth in Latino homeownership. Unfortunately, we saw like a lot of families and communities lose a lot of wealth and their homes during the foreclosure crisis. And since then, though, we have seen a steady increase in the number and also the rate of Latino homeownership. And so you've been seeing a narrowing of the homeownership gap between white households and Latino households, which is really great. This data, and I'm sorry, I just realized I didn't put in the most recent slide. Interestingly, the most recent data we have, while the number of Latino homeowners continues to increase, we are sadly beginning to see a slight decrease in the homeownership rate. And that's primarily driven by the fact that Latino households are forming at a faster rate than we're achieving homeownership. And so it's kind of just that demographic growth. And I'll speak a little bit more kind of to this a little bit. So you are seeing the number of Latino homeowners growing, but the rate is slowing down just because of just the affordability constraints in housing, and then the continued growth in demographics in the household formations for Latino families. So, in the last couple of years that I've spoken with you all, I've shared just kind of some national, just the kind of macro trends in homeownership. And this year I want to do something a little bit different because, Juan mentioned at the beginning, we have this goal of 4 million new Latino homeowners between 2020 and 2030. So it's 2025. And so we're around midway. And so we've been this year doing a little bit of a deeper dive to understand what happened in the first half of this decade and how can that help us think about kind of what we have, the kind of the journey that's still left for us between now and 2030. And so in looking at that, we've divided up the first half of the decade into these 2-year increments that we're calling it the Latino Homeownership Eras Tour. And so we think about the beginning of the decade, we're calling this the COVID era, followed by the inflation era, into what today, at least for now, we're calling the uncertainty era, which we're in now. And I'll dive a little bit into each of these briefly. So, for me, when I started looking at the trends in this way, it really made it so clear to me how our economy and what was happening in local markets and nationally really shaped, what consumers do. And in this case, we were looking specifically at Latino home buyers and homeowners. And so when you think about the beginning part of this decade, at the start of COVID, two really big trends, happened. The first is we saw, a really like historically low interest rates, which really improved affordability for a lot of households. And then we also, on top of that, saw that because a lot of businesses went to remote and hybrid work, there was a lot more flexibility in terms of where people could live. And so we saw a lot of migration patterns changed from what they had been before, and people really moving to other areas, whether it's for affordability or just to, have a larger house or whatever it was that they were looking to have that flexibility. And so that's a lot of what the surge. And so in that COVID era, we saw a really huge growth in Latino homeownership in the first couple of years of this decade. And then you kind of move a couple years forward and we entered the inflation era, which then is when we started seeing a rise in interest rates, of course, which really hit at affordability, especially on top of, we saw kind of the shortage of supply because of all the purchases that had happened kind of at the start of the decade, and we hadn't kept pace with the building. And then on top of that, there were just kind of the broader inflationary trends. And so, if we kind of think back to this era, there were inventory shortages. And so for home builders, the cost of materials, even appliances, it was really hard to get a hold of some of these materials, but also the price of them really increased. For a lot of households, they were really struggling at this time to save money because they had been able to squirrel away some money at the start of the decade because of some of the government supports, combined with that we weren't going anywhere. But then in the inflation era, that really started hitting into savings rates. So for a lot of families that were still trying to save for that down payment, it made it much more challenging. And so we started seeing a slowdown in the rate of increase in Latino homeownership during that era. And then you move to, well, before we go into the current era, I was just going to give a little bit of an example around migration patterns. And you guys probably have seen a lot of this, but, people, I wanted to zero in on just that comment around migration patterns changing. And, I think that you probably have seen this in your business, but two of the big kind of migratory patterns that I saw in this space, specifically to Hispanic homeowners and home buyers, is we saw a lot of Latinos leaving California, and many of them went to places like Texas and Arizona for relatively lower, better affordability, maybe with just more selection in terms of, house options. And so that was a really big shift in population. And then similarly, if you go to the East Coast, the Latino population centers of New York and New Jersey, we saw really big movements of Latinos leaving that region to go south. And a lot of them went to Florida and to North Carolina, which I think, Carolina, I think you're both in North Carolina, if I remember correctly. But, you probably have met a lot of Latinos from New York and New Jersey who in recent years have moved down there. But those are just some of the ways that, again, the comment I made earlier that, you have these macro trends of what's happening in our economy, what's happening in different employment sectors, and that really influences the decisions that individual households make. And then you see the numbers happening in these big macro ways that ends up kind of moving where markets are. So moving to the era that we're in now, and for now I'm calling it the uncertainty era. We're kind of in the middle of it. We're looking at like 2025 to 2026, and I really think that the story is still being written, because on the one hand, as you guys all know, we're seeing some hope for lowering of interest rates. It's unlikely we will go back to the historic lows at the start of the decade, but we are seeing a little bit of, optimism in terms of lowering interest rates. But at the same time, there's been a lot of debate around, macroeconomic, monetary policy and the Federal Reserve independence and what influence that might have on, interest rate spreads. And so I think there's a little bit of question about what the true impact will be for home buyers in this year and into next year. There's a lot of conversations right now around the future of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And, if you follow, Director Pulte or, even the president on X and on social media, there's been a lot of talk about, potentially an IPO or some kind of release. And we all know how important Fannie and Freddie are to our housing market. So that's something that we're all kind of watching very, very closely. And then there's other macro policies, like, there's been a lot of focus by this administration on immigration actions in different communities. And, you probably all have seen some of the social media posts around, the impact that has had on different sectors, including the construction industry.
Agriculture.
Yeah, agriculture, a lot of the sectors, in the health sector, like, nurses, home health aides, a lot of kind of the critical sectors in our economy are supported by immigrants. And so I think we're still kind of seeing what the impacts will be on any potential labor constraints in those sectors due to immigration. And then, of course, there's tariffs, and that has had a direct impact on home builders. There's been talk about declaring a national housing emergency, which might allow kind of special consideration for certain types of materials to maybe get exempted for some of the tariffs. But again, that's still, at this point, a lot of this is still conversations and policy debates. And so it's still to be determined what the impact's going to be on the pocketbooks of home buyers and homeowners and the decisions people are making. But I think there are a lot of people right now that even if they're ready to buy a house, they might be deciding just to kind of hold off a little longer, either because they're a little uncertain about their own economic condition, job stability and all of that, or just kind of the direction. So, hopefully we'll have a little more certainty in the months to come, but this is kind of the era that we're in right now. And,
Or their
maybe
legal status too.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's so many considerations and just we just don't know where things will end up. And, I think when I think about looking at sort of these different eras that we've had, even in just this, we're only 5 years into the decade, it really, for me, it really pointed to kind of an opportunity cost. And because we all know the demographics of Latinos, it's one of the fastest, ethnic groups in terms of population growth. Our community is younger on average than other groups. Are forming households at higher rates and at younger ages. And so demographically, we are entering prime home buying years. And I think if you look at the start of the decade, when the economic conditions are good, so when there's inventory, when there's affordability, what you see is a really big growth in Latino homeownership, particularly in Latino population centers like Los Angeles and Miami and Phoenix, which is kind of what you would expect, right? Because that's where the populations are. Then when you kind of shift to an economic situation where affordability is much more constrained, whether it's just due to housing supply or interest rates or a combination, that's when you start seeing a bit of a stagnation in the growth of homeownership in those same markets. And I think of it as kind of an opportunity cost, like just as Latinos are entering prime home buying years, there are just so many headwinds in the housing market. And my hope is that we'll start seeing improvements. And then I think then we'll just see another kind of unleashing in Latino homeownership growth if the economic conditions are amenable to home buying, and particularly for first-time home buyers. So with that, I'm going to shift to a little bit on public policy, and I apologize, this is a little bit blurry. This is I grabbed this image from a report that we published with the Urban Institute. I think we issued it in June during Homeownership Month. And in this paper, we were calling for a national housing strategy to support first-time homeownership. And it's really focused on federal policy levers to aid in homeownership growth. And, I think there's still a lot of folks who feel that, housing is like a local issue and the federal government doesn't have a big role to play. But what we wanted to provide is kind of a roadmap, especially for policymakers here in DC, whether at the regulators, in the administration, or even on Capitol Hill, pointing out the different ways that the federal government does have a really big influence in our housing market. And we organized it by policy levers on the supply side. And so, home construction, policies for housing developers, and also the levers that the federal government has to support demand or home buyers themselves, whether it's through down payment assistance, potentially, tax credits for first-time buyers, even, supporting home buyer education and counseling. And there at the end of my presentation, I have a link to our website where you can find the full report of this. But it really, for us, this was a way to educate policymakers in Washington, D.C. that, they have a really important role to play in supporting our housing sector, which I always like to remind people, housing, depending on the year, represents anywhere from around 17 to 20% of our country's gross domestic product. And so, having a strong housing sector is really important to having a strong economy, nationally, as well as in local communities. So in terms of public policy, I will say that for the last year plus, the real big focus has been on housing supply. And one thing that it's been really interesting trend that I've seen is, if you would have looked several years ago when people thought about the challenges of housing affordability and housing supply, they thought it was just a coastal issue, like, that's just New York and California, or Miami, like those are just really unique markets. But now when you talk to, like when I talk to, Hill staffers, here in DC on Capitol Hill, it's clear that housing affordability is a challenge everywhere. And the housing supply crisis, it's in every state in the country. It's in rural areas, it's in urban areas, it's in, red states, blue states, it's everywhere. There are a lot of data points out there around the shortage of homes that we have. One group that we're a member of, Up for Growth, they really focus on housing supply, federal advocacy, and the study that they do every year, they've identified that it's just under 4 million housing units that we're short. And that's all housing. So it's not just housing for homeownership, it's also rental, it's the whole spectrum of housing. But it really shows we've been underproducing housing ever since the foreclosure crisis, and we still haven't dug out of that hole. But another related trend, looking more specific around homeownership, is the size of housing. And while, I'm a big HGTV junkie, I'm sure many of you are as well. And so, you always see this trends around tiny homes and all of that. But despite that kind of popularity in some places, overall, we still like our larger houses. And we've really been building fewer and fewer smaller homes, which kind of, again, points to that starter house, that house that's affordable to a first-time buyer that may not be their forever home, but it gets their foot in the door. And in many markets across the country, it's almost impossible to find, a starter house like that. There is this trend toward building bigger. So that's a little bit of kind of the backdrop for some of the policy advocacy that we've been focused on. And so, I mentioned earlier that Unidos, in terms of policy and advocacy, we work both at the federal level as well as at the state level.
Yeah.
And a lot of the work we're doing around pro-housing policy is focused on home building. And, I kind of summarized it here. It's really it's around removing barriers. And so, again, every community is going to be different. And so the policies that we're advocating for in California may differ than what we're advocating for in Texas. But at a big picture level, we think there's a lot of opportunity around zoning and land use reform that, increases density. And so reducing minimum lot size, even lot division, which is allowed now in California. Permitting reform is a big one. So really expediting and streamlining the approval process. And this is something that California is doing a lot of work on, and especially they're piloting a lot of work in the LA area related to the rebuilding of like Altadena and the Palisades, following the fires earlier this year. But also allowing different types of housing. And this is kind of related to the increasing density. In some communities, historically, land use policy has limited the type of house you can build in a lot. But we've seen in places like in Houston, which several years ago, it changed a lot of their policies to allow for more townhomes, duplexes, those kinds of policies. We've seen an increase in their housing supply, particularly for those types of housing, which again is a really great option for a lot of first-time buyers. And then another area that we really think there's a lot of opportunity is around thinking about the way we build housing, and not just the traditional site-built, stick-built housing, but looking at things like accessory dwelling units, which have seen a really big growth in a lot of places, especially like in California, but even allowing for, modular construction, even manufactured housing, which, in some cases might help reduce the cost, but for sure expedites or helps speed up the process of how long it takes to build housing. And so, we've been following the trend, the policy in a lot of different states, and we've been seeing that like all of these reforms are happening in blue states like California, but even red states like Arkansas and Montana and Texas have passed just in the last couple of years a lot of legislation that's kind of just clearing the path to being able to build more housing, including for home ownership and starter homes. And then I also wanted to flag that you guys probably see all the headlines about Washington, D.C., and it's true that there are not a lot of issues where there's consensus across parties. But I will say that one bright spot is housing. And I think it just goes back to this issue that housing, affordability and access to housing, whether it's rental or that being able to buy that house, that is something that is an issue in every state across the union. And last week I was at an event and I had the honor of listening to a panel. It was Congressman Mike Flood, Republican from Nebraska, who is the chair of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee of the House Financial Services Committee, and also Congressman Cleaver from Kansas City, who's a Democrat, who is the ranking member on that same subcommittee. And they were on this panel together, and it was just an amazing thing to watch because on housing policy, they were 100% on the same page, and they're working together really closely. You may have heard earlier this summer, the Senate Banking Committee unanimously passed the Road to Housing Act out of their committee. This is a bill that was co-sponsored by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, Republican, and Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts. Again, there's very few things that Senator Scott and Warren agree on, but this bill, which has probably 10 or 11 titles, meaning different sections, it's a really comprehensive bill. There was agreement and it passed the subcommittee, the committee unanimously across party lines. And so I really see a lot of reason to be optimistic for housing policy. I'll add that in the panel that I listened to last week, Congressman Flood said that the Republican pollsters are telling Republicans that the number one domestic policy issue right now is housing. And so I just think there's a lot of likelihood that we're going to see, some action on housing policy at the federal level, which I'm really excited about.
Laura, with that being said, wouldn't you agree that there's got to be some type of innovation in housing, finance, and policy
Yes.
to kind of complement with the issues of inventory and credit, all that stuff? I mean, yes, we have a problem with inventory, but we need maybe new products, things that can help the Latino community afford or get into that dream house.
Yeah, 100%. And I agree. I think there's been a lot of advocacy around looking at new products, thinking about especially some of those segments that have been potentially underserved, like maybe self-employed or others. Right now, I think that's kind of getting folded into the conversations around the future of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But there have been something. So you may have seen, Director Pulte at FHFA has expedited the use of Vantage Score, in underwriting, and there's talk about moving from, a tri-merge, credit score to maybe just one. I saw something come through, I think it was yesterday, where it's not a bill yet, but it's been a proposal to remove the life of loan insurance requirement for FHA, which you all know for FHA borrowers, if they put less than 10% down, they have to pay like the equivalent of mortgage insurance. But unlike with Fannie and Freddie, they can't get rid of it later. And so that's been something that people have been talking about for a long time. And now we're seeing some movements. I think people are recognizing that we need both solutions on the housing supply and also on the mortgage finance side, and just really modernizing, our housing sector more broadly so that it works better for, particularly, again, I keep on going back to those first-time buyers. Those are kind of the ones closest to my heart.
Definitely.
If anybody, I wanted just to say that if anybody watching this has a question, please send it to the chat, and we can definitely ask Laura about it for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nice to have other avenues for like specialty programs, but if there's changes made within, Fannie Freddie and FHA, that would be so wonderful.
Yes, exactly. That I feel they're kind of the road to having that kind of at scale, sort of nationally. So I'm gonna go a little quickly in these next few slides because I do want to leave some time for questions. I mentioned earlier research that we do, and again, the link that I have at the end of my presentation, we have a page just focused on research. So any research papers I've mentioned are on there. Back in 2023, we published a research agenda for Latino homeownership, and I think we've either directly or indirectly have published about 10 to 12 research papers since then. And we are now in the process of updating that research agenda. It should be published around middle of October. But we're looking at various areas, and I have some examples here of some of the items that we're calling for research that hopefully we'll be able to do, or we might, be able to partner with like universities or academic institutions to advance some of this research. And then to close us out, I want to just, and I'll go through these kind of quickly, but I mentioned that we work with community-based organizations, in various places. We support housing, counseling, and education, but we also support, development. And so I have just a few pictures that I'll kind of run through, but this is an example of a modular home that's built down in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. One thing I love about this model, that this nonprofit, what they do is the modular construction allows you to add on. And so you can build your house with maybe 3 or 4 rooms, or, 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom. And then if down the road, you have a child, you want your mother to move in with you and you have a little extra money, you can actually add on another unit to this house. It's almost, they don't like it when I say this, but I think of it almost like Legos. But I think this is a really innovative concept for design. This house is in Chicago, in the back of the yards area, which if you're familiar with Chicago, it's kind of near Pilsen. And this nonprofit was given over 200 vacant lots by the city. And these are really narrow lots that are hard to build on. And they partnered with a modular builder to put in these modular homes. And they're just so lovely. And they're little by little putting in all of this infill housing. It's all for homeownership right in the middle of Chicago.
Laura, we have, and if you don't mind, we have a quick question
Oh
from
yeah.
Bill. Bill,
Yeah.
he said, from a lending standpoint, what are the top three things Unidos is asking lenders to do?
Oh my gosh, I love that. So I think if I had to do the top three, it would be, it's certainly the positive reporting, if they're not already, is considering that. I think it's finding ways for affordability. So whether it's kind of, down payment assistance, like we all love down payment assistance, but sometimes it's hard because there are so many programs out there. And so finding ways to be able to help a home buyer really maximize all the different programs that are out there to reduce that. And then the third is working with housing counseling agencies, especially for those borrowers or those home buyers who are not quite ready. I think there are a lot of people who start the process and they get really discouraged. And so I think housing counseling agencies are really great partners to help, maybe for that family that might need, more than 6 months. They might need a year or even longer to kind of save or rebuild their credit and really keep their motivation up to come back into the market and not get too discouraged.
By the way, we have a team member in Texas. Jessica Rodriguez is in Texas, so she threw some hearts as soon as she saw
I love it,
the
love
house
it,
in Texas.
love it. Well, here I'll display again. I love pictures of houses. This is an example of when we worked with a group in Milwaukee. Similarly, they got a series of lots from the city, really narrow, and they created these blueprints for these small houses. And this house sells for $100,000, and so
Wow.
they target it for
Oh, nice.
first-time buyers, and they're working with some schools to, especially for like early child care providers and teachers to, in the neighborhood. And then I think this might be the last one. This is in Portland, Oregon. This
Oh, I
group
love that.
this group is working with a modular builder around creating more fire-resistant timber technologies. And they're prioritizing these houses for families that have been displaced by wildfires in that area. And oh no, I lied. I had this one more. This is in the Inland Empire. Again, I love pictures of houses, but I'll because I do want to have some questions. But this is my final slide. If the QR code isn't, if you're not able to access it, just if you go to UnidosUS.org/homeownership, that's the landing page for the microsite, which has all of our work around policy research, and it has a lot of the examples that I've shared of some of the community-based works. But I think with that, I'm gonna stop sharing and I'd love if
This was amazing, Laura.
I have a
you or
question
others have
for you,
questions.
Laura.
Yes.
So we were talking about how you guys are advocating for change and innovation for guidelines, right? For more affordable and making it easier for some home buyers.
Mm-hmm.
In my 20 plus years, I've done more loans for mobile homes
Mm-hmm.
in the last couple of years than
Yeah.
I have in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Because it's more affordable for our first time home buyers and a lot of times, but mortgage insurance tends to be higher, or just like the approval itself is so much harder. Is that also something that you guys are advocating for these risks to
Yeah.
be looked at a little bit differently?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. And it really shows the connection between the supply and the demand, because while on the one hand, we are advocating for modernizing how we build housing and thinking about modular, manufactured, and all these
Right.
different types, you need the financing tools for it. And historically, that hasn't always been the case. And so we need to also modernize the underwriting. And, Fannie and Freddie, they have in recent years really been focused much more on manufactured, like financing for manufactured housing. And it's much easier today than it was. There's still the issue between whether or not the manufactured house is placed on leased land, like in a community, as opposed to on land that you owned, because then it makes the real estate lending a little bit easier. But I think that's a space that we're beginning, and there's a couple of policy proposals. Like I know there's a section in the Road to Housing bill that I mentioned. There's a whole title specifically around lending for manufactured housing. And so that's something that I think Fannie and Freddie and with this administration, including with Director Pulte at FHFA, they're really pushing Fannie and Freddie just to really focus much more on that sector, because they do think that it hasn't been served. And it is such a great pathway for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
Awesome. Laura, I got one more question. I actually got two, but I'll ask you this first one. This is from Travis Jones. He said, how can we help to increase the number of Hispanic realtors, loan officers in our industry?
Yeah, I love that, because I think, like I talk a lot about kind of the housing sector in terms of helping Latino home buyers, but the housing sector, and I'm thinking both like on the building side, but also on the realtor, loan officer, all of that, it's a really great career pathway. And I think especially realtors, like I just know there's so many folks, like for immigrants, it's a really great way to become an entrepreneur and, build a career and build a business. And so I think there's a lot of appeal to it for folks. And I think, there's a little bit of education. We actually at Unidos, with my colleagues on the workforce team, we have a program that's funded by several banks called Latinos in Finance. And part of that is helping Latinos who maybe haven't finished college get some like basic training to be able to get careers in, with a lender or with a bank, and kind of that, starting in their career in that sector. And so I think a lot of it is, awareness for many of us. If we didn't have someone who was, working in that industry growing up, it might just not be something that we think about is even like, oh, that's like a career that I could potentially, follow into. So I think a lot of it is kind of education and outreach, working with like, in community colleges or universities, and showing the path, because I think it's a really great career someone can build in that sector.
Thank you so much, Laura. And this is just a wacky question. A couple of weeks ago, I asked our team members on our Latino chat, Hispanic Heritage Month. I wanted them to share their favorite dish from their country, and we got so many pictures. I believe at the end of that chat, we were all really like, "Oh my God, we're so hungry." Laura, what's your favorite dish if you will have to pick a dish?
Oh my gosh!
That reminds me of your heritage, your family, your mother.
Yes, yeah. Oh my gosh, I immediately think, oh my God, how do I pick just one?
There's so many.
I know. I will say that I love tamales, and for me, growing up, tamales equates with Christmas, because that's what we always, we would do a tamalada, during Christmas time, and so it's a tradition that I grew up with my grandmothers and my cousins and aunts, and now I do with my kids and my brothers when they're in town, and so awesome. Just in part because I love tamales in general, and you can make all kinds of different ones, but also just it like the emotional, it just signifies family and Christmas time for me.
I was just gonna say that it is funny, Laura, because in our cultures, everybody has a version of tamales, even in Colombia. And when you mention the word tamales, it means almost a gathering. Yes, everybody gathers to make them together as a family. Yep. And then share them together as a family.
Yep.
Laura, it's been amazing. We would love to have you again. You are more than welcome to come back. Thank you so much for all the insight, and we really truly appreciate your efforts to help the Hispanic community achieve the goal of homeownership. Thank you so much, Laura.
Oh, thank you. I love being here. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, guys. Bye, everybody. Thank you for tuning in.
Bye.